Welcome to the Tank Podcast. On this week's episode, Faisal Devji considers how civil war has replaced revolution as the main mode of political conflict globally.
So I want to talk about the return of civil war as the engine of political conflict globally today. And we see this not only in the many civil wars that are occurring around the world, the famous ones being Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan and the ex-Yugoslavia and many parts of the ex-Soviet Union like Tajikistan. And these are often either preceded by invasions from the outside or followed by invasions. Sudan is only the latest one. All these civil wars, tend to happen in the world outside the West, but even in the West, you see rather more polite versions of what could be termed civil war in secessionist movements and attempts, such as in Scotland, for instance, to split the United Kingdom, and you see similar projects in parts of continental Europe as well. Perhaps this was brought to our attention most clearly and starkly in the attack on the Capitol following the election of President Biden, where you actually have large numbers of people refusing to acknowledge the election results and wanting a civil war. Suddenly Confederate flags were out. Invocations to the US Civil War of the past of the 19th century abounded, and the idea of polarization, which now characterizes many Western societies, has built into it also the distant or intimate possibility of civil war. There's a political theory explanation of how this happens, that civil war becomes a major theme in modern political thought in the 17th century, precisely with the creation of the modern nation state, the modern state that will become a nation state. And once you have such a state created, then civil war becomes your worst dystopian nightmare, because it's the destruction of the state that is at issue. This vision of horror is most familiarly associated with the philosopher Thomas Hobbes from the 17th century. And it has remained a nightmare for politics, but you understand that civil war, therefore, is both enabled by the existence of the nation state. Without such a state, you wouldn't have an image of civil war, but it's also destructive of the very state that enables it. So it's a paradoxical thing that we're talking about. So, in the mid-20th century, a political theorist called Hannah Arendt argued that civil war had been the great nightmare of early modern political thought in Europe. But by the end of the 18th century, it had stopped being a nightmare because it had transitioned into the idea of revolution. So suddenly civil war, which was a vision of horror, gave place to the idea of revolution, where people are deliberately trying to change the political order. And revolution is seen, at least by its proponents, as a good thing, whereas civil war is never seen as a good thing by anyone on either side of it. I think what's happening today is that we're seeing a reversal of this logic. As the tradition of revolution has ground to a halt, from the color revolutions, which didn't, let's admit it, lead anywhere, to the Arab Spring revolutions, they were all called revolutions, which also have not really led anywhere at all. They have reinstated dictatorships in all cases. We seem to have reached a kind of dead end as far as revolution is concerned, and there seems to be, therefore, a return to civil war as the only way of thinking about political change. But there's an alternative genealogy at play here as well, and that has to do with the end of decolonization. Decolonization begins in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan, and that sets into motion a whole chain of subsequent acts of decolonization all over Africa and Asia. And that ends basically around 1971 when the United Arab Emirates become independent. But 1971 is also the year when you have the Pakistani Civil War. And in that war, Pakistan is split into two countries, what is today Pakistan and what is today Bangladesh, what used to be East Pakistan. And I think the Bangladesh war, which was a genocidal war, it was extremely violent, marks the return of civil war to the political logic of the new global order. After that, it's civil war all the way down. There might be invasions as well, but what the return of civil war indicates then is the end of the process of decolonization, because what happens with Bangladesh, the emergence of Bangladesh out of Pakistan, is the fight is no longer against the colonizing power. The fight is against another nation state. The fight is against the post-colonial nation state. So we have the end of the post-colonial period and the beginning of this new world in which we all live, where civil war seems to be the model. But there's something problematic about civil war, not simply in the fact that it's horrific or can be horrific, but in the fact that we are unable to think beyond it. So if you think even of popular culture and Hollywood films, even when we are talking about asteroids hitting the earth or aliens or whatever, very often the true horror in view is the civil war that follows such, or that precedes even such a catastrophe. And we often think of climate change like this as well, that it will create disorder and there will be civil war and nothing will stand and the state will fall apart and people will just be at each other's throats. So this 17th century idea of civil war as the worst of all possible evils really has been entrenched to such a degree that we are unable to consider the new threats that face us, such as climate change, in any other way than cast our minds back to Thomas Hobbes. And there is a real problem here, because in turning around this circle, we're unable to think of new ways of exiting the problem. As I said, the state both is at risk of civil war, but it also provokes civil war. It's the cause, and the victim of civil war. But when you think more capaciously about catastrophes and disasters, civil war needn't be a major part of them. When you think of climate change in the past, and we know it through archaeological and historical investigation, you have dispersals of population, you have smaller scale societies, you have accommodations of various kinds. Now, these are the very things that the nation state is built not to allow. So the movement against refugees and the movement for hard borders precisely disallows movement, it disallows dispersal. And so it's meant to prevent internal violence seen as being a consequence of eternal diversity, but what it does is exacerbate the violence that it is meant to forestall, and it cannot go on forever. So there must be a way of thinking about catastrophes and collapses. Often they are slow motion ones. They're not the way we imagine catastrophe, that it's going to happen all of a sudden like in a Hollywood film and we're all going to be at each other's throats. Now, the only person I know of in modern times who has actually looked at this vision of horror signaled by the Civil War and had it as it were blink rather than him is Mahatma Gandhi, who already in the 1940s is saying to the British, who are telling him, look, if we are not here, there'll be a civil war between Hindus and Muslims. We need to keep the peace. Or if you don't partition this country into India and Pakistan, there'll be a civil war. And he said, let there be a civil war, just leave. During the Second World War, he said, let the Japanese come, leave. We are able to deal with a civil war because it doesn't have to be the Hobbesian kind of monstrous horror that you imagine. If you think outside the idea of the nation state, then this is not an inevitability, and you must consider other ways in which we can cohabit in society and between societies. And it makes me wonder whether the rise and the return of civil war signals actually the crisis of the modern nation state itself. Because what happens in civil wars is they're never resolved. The United Nations, so long as it exists, it comes in and declares, often through a campaign of bombing, a kind of armed peace, and then those bits of territory, Kosovo, Bosnia, etc., get to be managed forever by the international community or the European Union. And so what you're doing is creating dysfunctional states that require endless amounts of foreign aid and military force to exist. So this is creating new states within the international order that actually are not sovereign and that don't self-subsist. And they are a drag and a kind of weakness of the international order. So I think we are at some kind of dead end, and civil war is not just a return to the 17th century. It really shows us that we have run out of ideas and that we are sticking to this old narrative. But the world and its new catastrophes, like climate change, require a completely different way of understanding the present.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.